Lily woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside her window, the soft morning light streaming in through the curtains. It was a typical day in the small town of Mill Creek, a place where everyone knew everyone, and life moved at a slow, predictable pace. Lily stretched and pulled the blanket off her bare feet hitting the cool wooden floor. The smell of pancakes drifted up from the kitchen, and she knew her foster mom, Mrs. Adams, was already preparing breakfast. It was a simple routine she had come to enjoy. Lily wasn't used to this sense of normalcy, having been in and out of foster homes most of her life. But Mrs. Adams, with her kind eyes and warm smile, had given Lily the closest thing to a real home since her parents had passed away. Lily lived in a modest house on the outskirts of town, just a short walk from the school. Her foster family was kind, but she often felt like an outsider. Her past, a collection of scattered memories and fractured relationships, was something she didn't share with anyone. She had learned to keep her thoughts to herself, to slip through the cracks and avoid drawing attention. It wasn't that she didn't want friends or that she didn't appreciate the care of Mrs. Adams. It was just that every time she felt she might let her guard down, something in her past reminded her of the uncertainty she'd always lived with. Today, though, Lily felt an unusual sense of peace. She put on her old sneakers and grabbed her school bag, giving Mrs. Adams a quick hug as she passed through the kitchen. "Bye, Mom," she said softly, using the word that felt the most natural to her now. Mrs. Adams smiled back. "Have a good day at school, sweetheart. Be careful, okay?" "I will," Lily replied, her heart light as she stepped outside. The sun was already warm, and the streets were filled with the hum of daily life in Mill Creek. People waved as she passed, their friendly greetings lost on her as she focused on getting to school. Her mind was preoccupied, not with the day ahead, but with the feeling of something about to change. It wasn't something she could explain, just an unsettling sense that today wouldn't be like any other. The walk to school was uneventful, but as she neared the park where she usually cut across to get to the schoolyard, something caught her attention. A man stood near the entrance, his eyes darting around nervously, scanning the area as if he was waiting for someone. She couldn't help but notice the way he kept looking over his shoulder, as though expecting someone to appear out of nowhere. The man was tall, wearing a faded leather jacket, and his hands were buried deep in his pockets. Lily slowed her pace, instinctively becoming more alert. There was something off about him, something that sent a ripple of unease through her chest. The park was usually full of children, parents walking dogs, or elderly residents sitting on benches reading newspapers, but today it was empty, save for the man. She stopped and observed him for a moment, wondering if she should cross the street to avoid him. But before she could make a decision, she heard a voice. "Hey, you okay?" Lily turned to see a boy from her class, Tim, walking up to her. Tim was the type of person who was always smiling, always trying to make everyone feel comfortable. But Lily had never been good at making small talk. She nodded politely. "Yeah, I'm fine." Tim followed her gaze toward the man in the park, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What's up with that guy? He looks, I don't know, weird." Lily wasn't sure how to explain it, but something about the way the man was standing, alone and on edge, sent an instinctual warning deep inside her. "I don't know," she said quietly, not wanting to alarm Tim, but not wanting to ignore the gut feeling gnawing at her either. "Just, something doesn't feel right." Tim shrugged, seemingly unconcerned, and waved goodbye before heading off toward the school entrance. Lily, however, couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. She felt like she was standing on the edge of something huge, something life-altering, and she couldn't look away. As she walked the last stretch toward the school, she tried to shake off the anxiety that had gripped her. The bell rang, signaling that class would soon begin. Lily hurried into the building, trying to focus on the lessons ahead, but the feeling of unease lingered, like a shadow trailing her wherever she went. Lily's instincts screamed at her to keep watching, to keep track of every movement, no matter how small. She tried to steady her breathing, forcing herself to focus. Officer Tom moved into the park slowly, his eyes scanning every shadow, every corner, every space where someone could be hiding. Lily followed his every move, as if the connection between them had shifted in that instant, a bond formed by the shared knowledge that something terrible was looming. The officer had a job to do, but Lily had already done her part by alerting him. It was now out of her hands. Her thoughts wandered briefly to her life before all of this. She had always been the quiet, observant one, the girl who noticed things others didn't. People often called it a gift when they praised her ability to read the room, to sense things before they happened. But Lily knew better. It wasn't a gift. It was a necessity. When you grow up like she had, moving from one foster home to another, learning how to blend in and avoid attention, you develop a sixth sense for danger, for threats that lurked just out of sight. It wasn't something you could turn off, no matter how much you wished it away. And now, here she was, facing the very thing she had been trained to avoid all her life: danger. But there was no turning back now. Officer Tom was already approaching the man, his pace steady, but every muscle in his body tense with the awareness that something could go wrong at any moment. Lily couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. Had she done enough? Could she have done more? She had no idea what she was walking into, no idea what this man was capable of. She glanced toward the street, half expecting someone, anyone, to come running by, to break the eerie stillness of the park. But no one did. The world outside of this moment felt distant, as though it were happening in another place entirely. Then it happened. The man, who had been standing still, suddenly tensed and began walking toward the entrance of the park, his movements jerky and unnatural. Lily's heart skipped a beat. She watched as he reached into his jacket, pulling something from inside it. Her stomach dropped as she saw the glint of metal, a knife, small but lethal-looking, held loosely in his hand. It wasn't just a random weapon, she realized. It was something he had been ready to use. Before she could react, Officer Tom sprang into action, his radio crackling again as he called for more backup, his voice low but urgent. "We've got a situation here. Send more units to the park. Now." The man froze, his head snapping toward the officer, eyes wide with panic. Lily held her breath. Was he going to run? Fight? Her body tensed, the anticipation unbearable. Everything had changed in an instant. What had once been a quiet, ordinary afternoon now felt like a ticking time bomb, each passing second adding pressure to the already volatile situation. Lily's thoughts raced, but there was no time to think further. The officer had already closed the distance, shouting for the man to drop the weapon. But the man's eyes weren't filled with the fear Lily had expected. Instead, there was something else there, something far more dangerous. Desperation. The kind that led people to do the unthinkable. "Drop it," Officer Tom commanded again, his voice firm, but his hand hovering near his own weapon now, ready to defend himself if necessary. The man's grip tightened on the knife, his face contorting with rage. The situation was escalating faster than anyone had anticipated. Lily's pulse raced as she stepped forward, instinctively taking another step closer, unable to tear her eyes away from the confrontation. She had seen this kind of tension before, in the eyes of people who had nothing left to lose. But there was something else in the man's eyes, too. Something cold and calculated. And for the first time, Lily realized that she wasn't just dealing with a person in distress. She was dealing with someone who had a plan, someone who was about to act on it. And then, just as quickly as the tension had risen, the man took off, bolting toward the exit of the park, the knife still clutched tightly in his hand. Officer Tom immediately pursued, shouting into his radio for backup. But the man was fast, too fast. Lily felt her heart leap into her throat as she saw the officer gaining on him. The chase was on, and every second felt like an eternity. She stood frozen in place, watching as the scene unfolded before her, unsure of what role she had just played in this life-altering event. One thing was certain, though, her life, and the lives of everyone in this town, had already been changed. There would be no going back. The pursuit continued, but Lily knew that everything was about to take a turn she never could have predicted. She had no way of knowing just how far the events of this afternoon would ripple through the town, affecting not just her, but everyone around her. And as she watched the scene unfold, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment settle in her chest, knowing that this was only the beginning of something much larger. The chase was a blur. Officer Tom's voice echoed in Lily's ears, but the words were lost in the pounding of her heart as she watched the man dart toward the park exit. He was fast, far faster than she'd anticipated, and for a split second, she thought he might escape. But Officer Tom wasn't giving up that easily. His long strides ate up the distance between them, his focus locked on the suspect with an intensity Lily had never seen before. There was no hesitation in his movements. He was trained for this, ready for anything. Lily stood frozen at the edge of the park, her breath shallow, watching the two figures blur in and out of sight as they ran past the trees and along the pathway. The tension in the air felt suffocating. She couldn't help but think that if she had just stayed home, none of this would have happened. But that thought quickly passed. Something inside her, something deep and undeniable, told her that this was exactly where she needed to be. Just as the man reached the street, a loud crash rang out from behind him. Officer Tom had tackled him to the ground. The sound of their bodies hitting the pavement echoed through the park, and for a moment, everything was still. Lily's breath caught in her throat as she watched the officer wrestle with the suspect, trying to subdue him. But the man fought back with a ferocity that took even Officer Tom by surprise. His free hand reached for the knife again, but the officer quickly disarmed him, pulling the blade out of his grasp and throwing it to the side. Lily's stomach churned as she saw the man's face, a twisted mask of anger and fear. He was gasping for breath, his body pinned to the ground by the officer's weight. His wild eyes flicked from Officer Tom to Lily, and for a brief moment, their gazes locked. In that instant, Lily could see the panic and the desperation behind his eyes. This wasn't just a random act of violence. The man had been pushed to a breaking point, and whatever his motives were, they were tied to something far larger than just this moment. Officer Tom cuffed the man quickly, but his eyes never left the suspect, scanning him for any signs of a weapon or other danger. Lily took a hesitant step forward, her feet dragging, unwilling to break the silence that had fallen over the scene. The park was eerily quiet now, save for the distant sound of sirens approaching. She could hear the muffled voices of people in the nearby street, but none of them dared come close. They were all waiting, watching from a safe distance, not sure what to make of the situation unfolding before them. The sound of sirens grew louder, and within moments, several police units arrived, their vehicles skidding to a halt near the entrance of the park. Officers spilled out of the cars, rushing toward the scene. They immediately surrounded Officer Tom and the suspect, their hands on their guns, ready for anything. It was clear now that the situation had escalated from a routine patrol to something much more serious. The man, still pinned to the ground, began muttering under his breath, words that were too incoherent to make out. But Lily could sense the fear radiating off of him. He wasn't just afraid of being caught. He was afraid of something else entirely. "Get him into the car," one of the officers barked. The others moved in quickly, lifting the man to his feet and pushing him toward the police vehicle. Lily felt a strange sense of unease as they escorted him away, her mind racing with questions. Who was he? What had he been planning? And why had her gut instinct told her that something was wrong from the moment she had seen him? Officer Tom watched them drive off, his posture stiff as he stood in the middle of the park. He seemed unaffected by the chaos he had just witnessed, his expression unreadable. But Lily could tell that something had changed in him too. She had seen it in his eyes when he tackled the man. There was a flicker of something deeper there, a recognition of the danger they had just narrowly avoided. He turned to her, his eyes softening just a little. "You did good, kid," he said quietly, though there was no trace of warmth in his voice. It wasn't praise, exactly. It was more like an acknowledgement, a recognition of the role she had played in preventing something much worse from happening. She nodded, but the words didn't quite reach her. She wasn't sure if she was relieved, scared, or just confused. The aftermath of the event hit quickly. News of the attempted attack spread through the town within hours, carried by the whispers of neighbors and the clattering of phones. By the time Lily got home, she could already hear the murmurs of conversation as she passed her neighbors' houses. She had never been the center of attention before, and the spotlight now felt strange, uncomfortable. Everyone seemed to be talking about the incident. People were relieved, sure, but there was a palpable unease hanging in the air. They were all asking the same question. What had the man been doing there? And more importantly, who was he? Lily entered her house and was immediately met by Mrs. Adams, who had been watching the news. Her foster mother's face was tight with concern, but she didn't say anything right away. She didn't need to. Lily could tell that Mrs. Adams had already pieced it together. The woman had a way of knowing things, a kind of quiet wisdom that made her aware of every shift in the household. "What happened?" Mrs. Adams asked, her voice soft but firm. Lily hesitated, unsure of how to explain it. I saw him in the park. The man. The one who was arrested. Something about him didn't feel right. So I went to Officer Tom and told him." Mrs. Adams didn't say anything for a long moment, just looked at her with those steady, understanding eyes. "You did the right thing," she finally said, her voice quiet but filled with pride. "But you're not alone in this. Remember that. Whatever happens, we're in this together." Lily nodded, her chest tightening with the weight of the moment. She felt a strange mixture of pride and fear. She had done what needed to be done, but in the process, she had crossed a line she wasn't sure she could return from. The town had changed, but so had she. That night, as she lay in bed, the weight of everything that had happened settled over her. She couldn't shake the image of the man's wild eyes, the fear in his voice as he was led away. What had brought him to this point? What had he been running from? Lily didn't know the answers, but one thing was clear. She had just stepped into a world that was far bigger, far more dangerous than she could have imagined. And whatever came next, she would have to face it head-on. There would be no turning back. The following days passed in a blur for Lily. The entire town seemed to be talking about the events at the park. People whispered in the streets, speculating about the man's identity and what had really been going on. Some praised Lily for her quick thinking, calling her a hero. Others, though, weren't as sure. They had questions. Too many questions. Who was that man? And why had Lily been the one to spot him first? Was it just a coincidence, or was there something more to this? The stories shifted, and with them, Lily's sense of safety began to erode. At school, her classmates eyed her with a mix of awe and suspicion. Some, like Tim, congratulated her and wanted to know everything about what had happened. Others stayed away, as if afraid that by association, they might become part of whatever shadow was now hanging over her. Lily wasn't used to being the center of attention, and she certainly wasn't comfortable with the idea of becoming a local legend. It felt alien to her, like an unwanted costume she had been forced into. She didn't want the praise or the looks of admiration. All she wanted was to go back to a time when her life was simple, when she wasn't caught up in something bigger than her. The whispers followed her everywhere. At lunch, during class, even while walking down the street, she caught people staring at her, some with admiration, others with suspicion. The tension in the air seemed to grow heavier with each passing day, until it felt suffocating. And then one afternoon, just as she was walking home from school, she heard the news that sent a chill down her spine. The man, the one she had helped Officer Tom apprehend, had been linked to something much larger than anyone had anticipated. The authorities had discovered that he was part of a gang involved in a series of recent robberies across several towns. They hadn't just arrested a random suspect. They had uncovered an entire criminal network. And to make matters worse, the man was apparently not acting alone. There were others, many others, still out there. Lily stopped in her tracks when she heard the news from a neighbor who had overheard it on the local news. She had always known something felt wrong, but this was beyond what she could have imagined. The realization that she had played a pivotal role in uncovering a criminal network sent a wave of unease through her body. How had she known? How had her instincts been so accurate? The questions kept swirling in her mind, but none of the answers came. She had done what felt right in the moment, but now that moment was beginning to unravel in ways she couldn't control. At home, things weren't much better. Mrs. Adams had tried to reassure her, but there was an edge to the conversation that Lily couldn't ignore. Her foster mother was worried about Lily's safety, about the long-term impact of this event. "You've done something extraordinary, Lily," she said one evening, her voice thick with concern. "But you're not alone in this. We need to be careful now. There are people out there who might not take kindly to you being involved in all of this. It's bigger than we know." Lily tried to process everything Mrs. Adams was saying, but it was hard. She felt a growing unease in her chest, a sense that the calm, predictable life she had once known was slipping away, replaced by something darker and far more dangerous. The town, too, was changing. People who had once been friendly and familiar now seemed distant, as if they were holding something back. And the police, who had been so quick to praise her at first, now seemed to regard her with a cautious wariness. It was as if they, too, were questioning whether she had known more than she had let on. The situation reached its peak when Officer Tom paid a visit to their house. It was late in the evening when he knocked on the door, his face tight with exhaustion, his eyes shadowed by worry. Mrs. Adams answered, and after a brief exchange, Lily found herself standing in front of the officer, who had been a constant, reliable presence in the town. But now, something had changed. "I need to talk to you, Lily," Officer Tom said, his tone somber. He wasn't angry. No, that wasn't it. But there was a heaviness to his voice that made Lily uneasy. He motioned for her to sit down, and as she did, she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. "There's been some developments," Officer Tom began, his voice low. "We've linked the man you helped apprehend to several high-profile robberies, but there's more. His arrest has opened up a trail to something larger, something we didn't anticipate. We think that gang might be connected to organized crime, something bigger than we originally thought. There are people involved who won't take kindly to being exposed." Lily's heart skipped a beat. "You mean they're dangerous?" Officer Tom nodded. "Yes, very dangerous. And we're not sure how far this goes yet, but we need to make sure you're safe." Lily felt a cold wave of panic wash over her. She had never thought of herself as someone who would ever be in danger. But now, standing in front of Officer Tom, she realized just how deep the situation had gone. She had unknowingly become a part of something much bigger than herself, and as much as she had wanted to help, as much as she had felt like her actions had been righteous, she was now tangled in something she couldn't control. "But I didn't know," Lily said quietly, her voice trembling. I just saw him, and I thought he looked suspicious. I didn't know he was part of something like this. I didn't mean to get involved." "I know," Officer Tom reassured her, his voice softening. "You did the right thing, Lily. But the reality is that you've now become part of this story. And there are people out there who won't forget that." The words hung in the air between them. Lily felt her world tilt, the ground beneath her feet shifting. She had made a split-second decision that had changed everything. And now she had to face the consequences. She didn't know what they would be, or how her life would turn out, but she knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. As Officer Tom left, Lily sat in silence, trying to process what had just been said. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing tighter with every passing second. She thought about the man she had seen in the park, about the knife he had held, about the fear in his eyes. Was he just a pawn in a larger game? And more importantly, was she now in danger too? The next morning, as she walked to school, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The weight of the unknown pressed heavily on her shoulders, and for the first time in her life, she felt the sharp edge of fear. She didn't know who was after her or what they wanted, but she knew that the quiet life she had once taken for granted was now behind her. It was a sobering realization, one that would haunt her every step of the way as the story unfolded. And as she walked, she couldn't help but wonder, how far would this go? And what, exactly, had she unleashed with her two simple words? The days following Officer Tom's visit were a blur of uncertainty and tension. Lily couldn't escape the sense that something was looming over her, that every step she took was being watched, and every shadow carried the weight of danger. The town, once a peaceful and predictable place, had turned into something unrecognizable. There were murmurs in the streets, cautious glances exchanged behind closed doors, and conversations that stopped abruptly when she walked by. People had begun to look at her differently, not with the same friendly warmth they once had, but with something more akin to fear. She was no longer just the orphan girl who had moved into Mrs. Adams' house. She was a symbol of something larger, a connection to an event that had rocked the entire community. Lily's life, which had once been a series of small, quiet moments, had been turned upside down in the blink of an eye. She couldn't focus in school, the pressure of knowing that the very air she breathed might be filled with hidden threats leaving her exhausted. The whispers at the lunch table were incessant. Some of her classmates treated her like a hero, asking her about what had happened and what the man had said, wanting every detail, every word she could recall. But the questions made her uncomfortable. She hadn't signed up to be anyone's hero. She had just acted on instinct. She had just reacted to something that felt wrong. And now she was being thrust into a role she wasn't ready for. The weight of the situation began to press down on her more heavily each day. The realization that her actions had uncovered something much bigger than she could have imagined was both exhilarating and terrifying. The man who had been arrested was just a small piece of a larger puzzle, a puzzle that now extended far beyond her understanding. The gang he had been linked to wasn't just a group of petty criminals. It was part of an organized network that had roots in multiple towns. And now, with the discovery of this criminal enterprise, the town was no longer a safe haven. It had become ground zero in a much bigger battle. The local police had been stretched thin, trying to handle the fallout, but Lily could sense that they, too, were caught in the storm. They had expected a small-time bust, but they had stumbled upon something much darker. It wasn't just the town that had changed. Lily had changed, too. She felt a shift deep within herself, a transformation that she couldn't quite explain. The girl who had once hidden in the background, who had kept to herself and avoided attention, was now standing at the center of something that could shape the rest of her life. The weight of the decision she had made in the park was no longer something she could escape. She could no longer pretend that everything was okay. She was no longer the same person who had walked to school just a few weeks ago, unaware of how deeply her life was about to be intertwined with the future of this small town. Her emotions were a whirlwind, torn between the pride of having helped stop something dangerous and the fear that it was only a matter of time before the danger came for her. The days blurred together in a haze of constant vigilance. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always watching, following her every move. She didn't know if it was paranoia or if it was the reality of the situation. Either way, she couldn't ignore the nagging sensation that something was off. And then, one evening, everything changed. Lily was walking home from school when she noticed a black car parked by the curb. It wasn't unusual for cars to park along the road, but there was something about the way the car was positioned, the way it blended in with the shadows, that set her on edge. She quickened her pace, but the car didn't move. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she glanced over her shoulder and caught sight of the figure sitting in the driver's seat, someone watching her, waiting. Her heart began to race. She didn't know if she should keep walking or turn back, but before she could decide, the car started moving. Slowly at first, then picking up speed as it pulled alongside her. She instinctively moved closer to the sidewalk, trying to make herself as small as possible, hoping the driver would pass by without noticing her. But the car slowed as it reached her, the window rolling down just enough for a voice to slip through the gap. Lily. Her breath caught in her throat. The voice was deep, familiar, and it sent a jolt of fear through her body. She didn't recognize the man in the car, but she knew exactly who he was. The same man she had seen in the park, the one who had been arrested, the one whose arrest had set off a chain of events she couldn't control. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. He was out. He had been released, or perhaps he had never truly been caught. "Get in," he said, his tone casual, but there was an underlying threat in the way he spoke. "I'm not here to hurt you. I just need to talk." Lily stood frozen, torn between the instinct to run and the fear that running would only make things worse. This was it, the moment she had been dreading. She didn't know if she should scream, if she should find help, or if she should just keep walking and pretend she didn't hear him. But something told her that whatever he wanted, whatever he had come for, was bigger than anything she could outrun. She took a step back, shaking her head, her voice trembling as she said, "I don't want anything to do with you. I don't know who you are." The man's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something cold in his gaze. "You don't know who I am. Funny, because you're the reason I'm here. You brought this all down on us, girl. You started something you don't even understand." His words hit her like a slap, and she felt her chest tighten with fear. Her instincts screamed at her to turn and run, but her legs wouldn't move. She couldn't move. She was trapped in a moment that felt like a nightmare, one where the consequences of her actions had caught up with her in a way she hadn't expected. The man reached down, pulling something from the passenger seat, a folder of documents that he held up for her to see. "This is all your fault," he repeated. "Everything you've caused. You think the cops have it under control. You think they're going to protect you. You're just a kid, Lily. You have no idea what you've gotten into." Before she could respond, the car slowly pulled away, the engine's hum growing louder as it sped off down the street. Lily stood there, her heart pounding, her thoughts racing. She felt sick to her stomach, like the ground had been pulled out from under her. She had no idea what was coming next, but one thing was certain: she was in way over her head now. As she made her way home, her mind reeled with the implications of what had just happened. The gang was still out there, still watching her, and she was more deeply connected to their world than she could have ever imagined. She hadn't just been a bystander in a random encounter. She had triggered something far bigger, and now she was caught in the middle of it. Whatever came next, Lily knew that she couldn't escape. There was no going back now. Her life, her safety, and the future of the town were all intertwined in a way she couldn't have foreseen. And the only thing she could do now was face it head-on, hoping she could find a way to stop the storm she had started. The next few days were a blur of confusion, fear, and a growing sense of helplessness. Lily couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed, watched from every corner. The man in the car had said it was all her fault, that everything she had done had set off a chain of events far beyond what she had understood. And as the days wore on, she realized that he was right. Her involvement in the arrest, her two simple words that had shocked the police officer into action, had set off a cascade of consequences that she couldn't control. And now she was trapped in the midst of it all, with nowhere to turn and no way to escape. School had become unbearable. The once familiar hallways now felt like a maze of suspicion and distrust. Her classmates, many of whom had once been her friends, now treated her with wariness. They didn't know what to make of her, or of the rumors swirling around her. Some of them still treated her like a hero, a symbol of courage, but others seemed to keep their distance, as if they feared being connected to her in any way. The weight of their gaze made her want to shrink into the shadows, to disappear from the chaos that had erupted because of her actions. But that wasn't possible. Not anymore. At home, things weren't much better. Mrs. Adams was trying to keep things normal, but even she couldn't ignore the tension in the air. The conversations between her and Lily had become quieter, more cautious. Mrs. Adams would ask if Lily was okay, if she needed anything, but Lily could see the concern in her eyes, the unspoken fear that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't something they could weather together. The town was no longer the quiet, safe place it had once been. People had begun to lock their doors earlier, avoid walking after dark, and talk in hushed tones when they thought no one was listening. The fear of what was lurking just beneath the surface had begun to permeate every aspect of their lives. One evening, as Lily sat alone in her room, the sound of a knock at the door jolted her from her thoughts. Her heart skipped a beat, and she immediately stood up, her mind racing. Who could it be? Was it someone from the gang? Was it the man from the car, coming to finish what he had started? Or was it just someone with more questions about the arrest? She made her way to the door slowly, her hands trembling as she reached for the handle. When she opened it, her breath caught in her throat. Officer Tom stood there, his expression serious, but not unkind. He didn't look like he was there to arrest anyone or give bad news, but there was something heavy in his stance, something that made Lily's stomach twist. "Lily," he said, his voice calm but urgent, "we need to talk." She stepped aside, allowing him into the house. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and she had a sinking feeling in her stomach. What was this about? What was coming next? Once they were seated in the living room, Officer Tom looked at her with a level of seriousness she hadn't seen before. He wasn't just a police officer anymore. He was part of this web that had caught her in its grasp. "I'm sure you've heard the news," he began, his tone quiet but firm. "The man you helped apprehend was only the tip of the iceberg. We've uncovered a criminal network, one that's far more dangerous and widespread than we could have ever imagined." Lily nodded slowly, feeling the weight of his words sink into her chest. She had known it was bigger than just one man, but hearing the words confirmed her worst fears. "What does that mean for me?" she asked quietly, her voice shaky. "It means," Officer Tom said, "that you're in more danger now than you ever were before. The people involved in this network, they don't take kindly to being exposed. You've already made a target of yourself by identifying that man in the park. And now, because of you, the whole town is on their radar." Lily's heart sank. "So, what happens now? What do I do?" "There's not much you can do on your own," Officer Tom replied. "We're working on a plan to deal with the gang, but it's going to take time. In the meantime, we need to get you out of town, at least temporarily. It's not safe for you here anymore. They'll be watching you. They'll be watching everyone connected to you." The words hit Lily like a punch to the gut. Leave? She couldn't leave. Her life was here. Mrs. Adams was here. Her school, her friends, even if they didn't understand her, this was where she had built a life. She had only recently begun to feel like she belonged somewhere. And now, just like that, she was being told to leave it all behind. "I can't just leave," Lily said, her voice breaking. "I can't abandon everything I know. This is my home." Officer Tom's expression softened, and for the first time, Lily saw the empathy in his eyes. "I know this isn't easy, Lily. I can't even begin to imagine what you're going through. But the reality is, if you stay, you'll be putting everyone you care about at risk. Mrs. Adams, your friends, even the whole town could be in danger. This is bigger than just you and me. This is about stopping something that could harm a lot of people." Lily sat back in her chair, her mind spinning. Everything she thought she knew about her life was being upended. She had wanted to make a difference, to do something good. And now all her actions were threatening to tear apart everything she had built. She had never asked for any of this. She had never wanted to be part of something like this. But the consequences of her choices were already clear, and there was no easy way out. "I'll do whatever it takes to stop them," she said finally, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "But I don't want to leave. I can't just disappear." Officer Tom gave her a long, thoughtful look. "I understand. But for now, it's the safest option. I need you to trust me on this. Lily, the more we know about the gang and their operation, the better chance we have of taking them down. And right now, you're part of that. You're in this whether you want to be or not. But that doesn't mean we won't protect you. The next few days were a whirlwind of decisions, plans, and emotions. Lily and Mrs. Adams had a long talk about the risks involved, and though it was difficult, Mrs. Adams agreed that the best thing for Lily's safety was to leave town. The two of them packed up what little they could, ready to follow Officer Tom's advice. The town, the place Lily had come to love, had become too dangerous. The police were working on taking down the gang, but it was going to take time. They couldn't afford to wait, not when every day brought a new layer of danger. As the day came to a close, Lily stood at the window of her room, looking out at the place that had been her home for so long. It felt surreal. She had spent so many years dreaming of a home like this, of people who cared about her, of a life that felt safe. And now it was all slipping away. But Lily wasn't the same girl who had walked into this town a year ago. She had faced down fear. She had stepped up when others didn't. And now she was walking away with the strength of knowing that even in the face of overwhelming odds, she had made a difference. She wasn't running from the storm. She was just waiting for it to pass, knowing that one day she would return. And when she did, she would be stronger, braver, and ready to face whatever came next. As she packed the last of her things, she whispered to herself, "This isn't the end. It's just the beginning." And she knew, deep down, that she was right. She had already changed the course of her life and the lives of everyone around her. And no matter what came next, she would be ready to face it head on.